Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be here and to moderate this panel and discuss the issues that were so well described by the previous speakers. Before we get down to this, I would like to make one point. Most of us grew up and lived during the Cold War, which was dangerous, but thanks to the fact that the two opponents had nuclear weapons, that war never occurred. I think that probably MAD, mutually assured destruction, was what kept the two countries from attacking each other. Today, there's again talk of a Cold War. And I would say, be careful with terminology. The Cold War was about ideology and about a struggle for the minds of the world. Today, there's a serious tension, a growing tension, between the former Cold War opponents, the United States of America and the Russian Federation. But it's not ideology. It's a completely different issue. And in a way, it's even more important, because back in the bad old days, as some might say, the world was aligned behind one or the other. And today, that's no longer the case. Today, it's a lot of countries saying it's each one for itself. China is aligned behind no one. And so is India, and so is Argentina, and so is Brazil. And you go down that line and you'll see there are no unified fronts. And there's dangers lurking pretty much everywhere. And while today what's happening in Ukraine overshadows most of the events, there are a lot of other things going on in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran, in North Korea, in China, and that list is a long one. So I just wanted to kind of give a picture of what we might be talking about when we get down to business. And let me invite the members of the panel to take their seats, and as they move up, I will give you their names. Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States Congress. Sir, would you please take your seat? Ehud Barak, leader of the Atzmaut Party and former Prime Minister of Israel. Mr. Konstantin Zatulin, director of the Institute of the Countries of the Community of Independent States. Mr. Rajiv Sikri, former Deputy Foreign Minister of India. Alessandro Minutorizzo, the former Deputy General Secretary of NATO, representing Italy. And Samer Seif Al-Yazal, Director of the Research Center Al-Gumhuriya, Egypt. And if you'll permit me, I will also now sit down. I find it easier that way. I'm going to wait for the music. Thank you. There are two events that really are attracting attention right now. One, of course, is what's going on in southeast Ukraine. What are Russia's intentions? What is Kiev going to do? And the other is the agreement reached between Fatah and Hamas in Palestine, which, according to many, is really creating a stumble block insofar as the negotiations, peace negotiations between Israel and the PLO. And I suggest that those two issues, we start out with them. And if anyone wants to start, please go ahead. I can throw it to someone, But if there's anyone who really wants to jump on this, please go ahead. I'm going to wait 3 seconds. All right. In that case, Ehud Barak, do you think you might want to take that particular issue, the one with the PLO?
This is a surprise to many of us, and clearly, in terms of timing, short of the perfect timing for such a development, probably less than a week before the time is ending for the negotiation period. The real challenge is that the Hamas explicitly states his policy to be the elimination of Israel. He doesn't recognize Israel. He doesn't recognize any of the previous agreements. He never detached itself from terror. And in fact, since Arik Sharon, some of you have known him, quite right-wing hawk, toward the end of his political career, made a gallant U-turn and ordered the going out of Gaza of the last soldier, last settler, last Israeli settlement. Everyone believed that, okay, so now the road is clear for a benign Gaza Strip because there are no Israelis there, everything is open. It took 1.5 years and Hamas took over, and now we have about 10,000 rockets and missiles that cover Israel with a round of exchange every several months. So it's very bad. For Israel, the intuitive, almost instinctual response was, oh, if they join hands with Hamas, it means that they won't fight, not peace, and that's put an end. It buries the whole process. I hope that will not be the last judgment. I think that the response from Washington was quite balanced and accurate. They rejected the step as it is done and stated very clearly that the right way for Hamas is to recognize Israel, to detach itself from any terror activity, and to accept formally all the previous agreements that had been signed between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. If that's the case, the American position is that both sides will have to consider how to find a way to continue. I think that continuation of the negotiation, even short of having a breakthrough, is essential for both sides. It's far from being zero-sum game in the same spirit that Speaker Gingrich described it earlier. It's true on the macro and it's true in the microcosm. Excuse me, and I think that a way should be found. It's too important for all sides not to deteriorate into a showdown. Israel is very strong and the Palestinians are very tenacious, but I don't think that it will serve anyone, but to find a way to keep moving toward a separate disengagement, making the two-state solution the only possible one, because one-state solution means a tragedy for both sides.
Anyone can jump in when they want to. This is not the usual now, you, and you. One thing I would like to ask you, I interviewed Prime Minister Netanyahu not long ago, who basically said, as long as there's any nation that says we do not recognize Israel and Israel has no right to exist, as Hamas seems to say, there can be no negotiations. Yesterday, speaking when he was interviewed, he said, the PLO prefers to have peace with Hamas than to have peace with Palestine. So that seems to be a no way out way of saying this. I mean, do you think that there is really a way out? Should Hamas say, all right, we've changed our viewpoint. We grant Israel the right to exist. Would that be a major breakthrough?
First of all, it will be a great change in their policies. Many people in Israel will say, oh, we don't believe them, don't trust them, they're just a trick. They heard that this will be something that will save them from being isolated, so they chose it. But I say that there are no sure, there are no bulletproof kind of protection in diplomacy. There are always risks, and the risk of not having anything happens is a little bit more complicated. Many external observers are pointing to us, to the Israelis, of certain paradox. You cannot say, they tell us, on one hand, that, oh, we cannot make a real deal with Abu Mazen because he controls only half of his people. He doesn't have a control on Hamas. And on the other hand, when he joined hands with Hamas, they say, oh, we cannot talk with Abu Mazen because he joined hands with Hamas. That doesn't fly very, very stable. So I think that developments will follow. That's a step of, basically, of protest of Abu Mazen, and I think that time will show. There are many, you know, the devil and heaven are always in the details. I don't see yet this thing concluded. For Hamas, it's a major defeat. The reason that Hamas went into this agreement has to do with the fact that Sisi is very strong in Egypt. They cannot get any support. It's not Morsi. And even the support of Turkey under Erdogan became less kind of explicit and aggressive to him. So Hamas is isolated. Mention what happened in Saudi Arabia. They announced that Hamas also is almost a kind of terror organization. They are not in an easy situation. I believe that this situation will shape them, modify them. Once they say we recognize Israel, and then will come the real negotiation. We'll see what they are thinking about. But I think we shouldn't lose hope that something positive can come out of any kind of trouble. I tend to see always opportunities in difficulties, not the other way around.
You care to pick up on that? Anyone else? Is there anyone who'd like to talk about the Israeli situation?
Why
yes,
should
please.
they? You know, we drew a lesson from what happened in the last 2 years in the Middle East. Lesson number one is be modest with predictions, especially in regard to the future. Because we have seen, all have seen Mubarak was a very good friend of mine for generation. He employed 500,000 people in internal security services just to tell him when the people will start to come to Tahrir Square that he will be prepared for it. And he could not predict it. How can we? So no one dares very easily to predict. Let's wait and see.
Sir.
Well, I just wanted to suggest that it's never a good starting point if we paint any party as extremist and we cannot deal with them, because where then is the dialogue? And the other side could equally say, but there is Mr. Netanyahu, who is very extreme in his views, and we know that Israel is a divided society. I think what we must first recognize is that the problem is essentially one of land and of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Palestinians who feel that they have been evicted from land where their forefathers lived, and to which they feel that there is a legitimacy they have. Now, I know the Israeli case that this is the traditional land, but how do you reconcile these claims of land which was your forefathers 2,000 years ago and land which was your grandfathers or your fathers a few hundred years ago? I think that the second point which I would like to suggest is that it is going to be impossible if either side is looking for absolute security. There has to be a compromise. And for that, there must be a respectful approach on both sides that, okay, we think you have a point of view. But it's, the situation is not one-sided, that only one side are terrorists and the other sides are angels. I don't think it works like that.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Well, I would like to suggest that perhaps I mean, the issue you mentioned, relevant as it is not the most important issue today in the Arab region. It seems to me that what is really outstanding today is the fight for hegemony, if you like, in a way. The fact there is this Sunni-Shia divide, which is widening, and the major fragmentation of the Arab region. This seems to me to be really a central point, much more, if you like, if you allow me to say, than this point, relevant as it is that you mentioned, you know. And the breakup of the Gulf Cooperation Council recently, and the fact that Saudi Arabia withdrew its ambassador from Doha seems to be a major event. As Mr. Baez said, it's very difficult to predict the future, but certainly we are witnessing something which was never there before, because we always, I mean, I'm not an Arab, of course, I'm not an Israeli, but looking from outside, you know, we always look at the Arab region as a sort of unified, more or less thing, you know, the Arab League seems to cover everything. Now it's not the case anymore, and perhaps I would like even to go a little bit further and to suggest that in the future, perhaps the interest of the West, if I may use this term, and the United States, are more in line, perhaps in the future, with Iran, with some Arab country. So I think that there is a very important movement in that part of the world, which is perhaps even more important than the Ukrainian crisis, I'm sure we're talking about later.
I want, with your permission, to join with the same point, in spite of being Israeli. For decades, we are told, with the Israelis, that the root cause of all problems in the Middle East, the fountainhead of all the troubles, is the fact that we Israelis could not solve our problems with the Palestinians. As if by one miraculous step, we can change the world. I beg to differ, looking at the events around us. I was a prime minister some 12 years ago. I was ready to go further than anyone else before me to go and to strike a deal with Arafat together with President Clinton. We couldn't do it. Arafat deliberately chose to go to terror, but assume for a moment that we would have already had a peace agreement. We succeed to convince Arafat. Or Rabin and Peres could succeed in convincing him to strike a deal 5 years before. Or Ehud Olmert 6 years later. If we already had for a decade a peace between Israel and Palestinians, does anyone believe that Egypt would not be now under this struggle between Muslim Brotherhood and the army in a way? No, they were in the same place. Syria would still have been mired in a terrible civil war, and Iran would still have tried to turn into nuclear military power. Because however important, and it is important, especially for us and for the Arabs, and we have to take responsibility on both sides and try to break the obstacles along the way, but it is not the main root cause of all issues. And I really think that strategically, globally speaking, especially in these days where the dependency on the Arab energy, at least of the United States and the West, is going down dramatically, the most important challenge to the world stemming out of our region is the fight for hegemony of the Middle East and of the Gulf area, the dispute between Shiites and Sunnites, more accurately between radicals and moderates, and the struggle between the Arabs and Iran, which is not an Arab but Muslim big country. These are the issues that will disturb the whole world more intensively.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
A few comments, in fact, for what has been said. Number one, I believe personally, well, you know that in Egypt now we are suffering from Hamas as well, because Hamas is doing a lot of aggression and violence with the Muslim Brotherhood against Egypt for the time being. But having said that, I believe personally that having a negotiation, serious negotiation, Abu Mazen is a serious guy, he wants to have a serious negotiation with Israel to come out with a peace treaty between both countries, as well as to establish two states. I personally believe it's good for everybody that Palestine will sit at a table as one identity rather than two identities. Because if Abu Mazen will say, yes, we agree about that, maybe in Gaza Strip, they will refuse that, and then we'll come back to square one. And it's a kind of differences. So at the end of the day, we have to have one identity, I believe, impersonally, to negotiate with Israel. This is one issue. Second issue, regarding Egypt now, and having said that maybe 500,000 people were working for Mubarak to know what's going on, and it didn't work out. Maybe I disagree with that, because I was one of the people working in that organization, and we were only maybe 10% of that, so it's not really 500,000 people at all. The point is now, as Mr. Yehud Barak said as well, that it's an issue between army and Muslim Brotherhood. It's not like that. In Egypt now, it is an issue between a civilian system country, which we believe Egypt has to be an Egypt. It's not like another country which the religion is the main issue and religion is directing the country to anyway. We believe in moderate Islam personally. I am a moderate Muslim, but in the same time, I don't like aggression, violence by anybody, including political Islam, even in like Muslim Brotherhood. What we are facing now in Egypt, for instance, is instability because of I would say, realistic issues done by the Muslim Brotherhood and their supporters in regard of trying to get in power, trying to control the country with the help of others from outside as well as from inside. So at the end of the day, the stability of Egypt will definitely reflect to the Israeli issues as well as with the Palestinian issues. So it's by identity, you cannot, because we have a mutual border, so we cannot differentiate or separate the cases between Palestine, Israel, and Egyptian and Palestine issues. Thank you.
Mr. Zatulin, you wanted to say.
Thank you, Vladimir Vladimirovich, but I prefer to speak Russian if possible.
Well, that's your right. You can do that.
После 1991 года, после распада Советского Союза, а на самом деле для внимательных наблюдателей это очевидно, и до этого, в последний период его существования, мы в Москве больше не занимаем односторонней позиции в вопросе о том, кто прав и кто виноват на Ближнем Востоке. И все, что я хотел бы сказать в этой части нашей дискуссии, заключается в том, что позиция Российской Федерации, какой она мне представляется, совершенно очевидно состоит в том, что этот конфликт не должен расползаться и охватывать все новые страны региона. Мы счастливы, что не потребовалось на этом этапе военной операции против Сирии, которая казалась неизбежной еще менее года назад. Мы рады тому, что на самом деле, особенно после смены президента в Иране, наметились пути взаимопонимания в обсуждении иранской проблемы. Я хочу напомнить, что еще год назад речь шла не только о том, что Сирия может быть объектом атаки, но и международной атаки. Хотя гражданская война в Сирии продолжается, это, конечно, никого не может радовать. Но речь шла и о том, что руководители Израиля не исключали для себя превентивного удара по Ирану, который вот-вот, как казалось многим, встанет в число ядерных держав. И если мы проанализируем то, что не произошло за этот период на Ближнем Востоке, то, может быть, не все так плохо, как кажется людям, которые вовлечены в это и страдают от этого каждый день. Спасибо.
All right. Are we going to move on to Ukraine?
Can I make one remark about Iran?
Yes, please.
I want to tell you, I was a Minister of Defense in the last 7 years until a year from now of Israel, and we looked very seriously on Iran for the simple reason that I believed and still believe that a nuclear Iran will be, a military nuclear Iran will be a major destabilizer, not just for the Middle East, not just a threat for Israel, but for the whole world. From the point of view of Israel, it's closer to our face, And they used to tell the truth. Khamenei used to tell it, and others used to tell it, that Ahmadinejad was very colorful in his expressions. He used to say that Israel should be eliminated from map and history. I propose to any one of you to think what it means to the sovereign or elected government of a nation where other power doesn't produce Barbies or these small babushka kind of wooden toys, but produce nuclear weapons and tell explicitly and publicly that they want to eliminate you from map and history. We, with the experience of the Jewish people, cannot take it lightly. And I recommend to no one to preach us on this. Having said that, I think that they are still very manipulated, the Iranians, and we are still running a risk even after the interim agreement, because the very phasing of the agreement with Iran reduced the Iranian incentive to ever reach a permanent agreement. Once they loosened the sanctions, the next step from their point of view is to reach a modified interim agreement, then another modified interim agreement until Obama will be replaced, things will change, and opportunity will be found to move into military and nuclear capability. I tell you honestly, I remember vividly talking, I was head of our intelligence agency some 30 years ago, and my opposite number in Washington was Bill Casey under President Reagan. I remember sitting with him on the issue of Pakistani nuclear effort with the same questions. Uranium, plutonium, how deep the material is hidden, how many sites and so on. I remember sitting down with President Clinton 12 years ago on the Korean nuclear project. And of course, the same issues. What will happen if we hit the reactor down the stream? What will happen if we try to hit the enriched material? Many operational issues. But basically, I never suspected that either President Reagan or President Clinton didn't want to see Pakistan non-nuclear or North Korea non-nuclear. What we can learn from it, that even before the recent crisis, there is a huge difference between trying to achieve something and really achieving it. And the Iranians are clearly trying to go in the footsteps of exactly Pakistan, North Korea, turn a military nuclear power, and all the ways to satisfy them. I remember the Americans at the time, with the Pakistanis, tried to sell them 75 F-16s with a kind of quite visionary idea that with 75 F-16s, they will feel so self-confident vis-à-vis India that they don't need nuclear weapons. Now, many of these F-16s are wired to carry Pakistani nuclear weapons. That was the result of this clever...
Mr. Zatulin, you wanted to get in?
Спасибо. Я, конечно, читал то, что писал Хамейни, и, безусловно, все мы слышали речи господина Ахмадинежада, которого я лично помню еще мэром города Тегерана. Но один умер, а другой перестал быть президентом. И, наверное, на это стоит обратить внимание. А вопрос, который в связи с этими ядерными амбициями, конечно, беспокоящими всех, возникает, его же можно обратить и другим образом. Просто задать вопрос, вот я своему соседу справа хотел спросить, а является Израиль ядерной державой или нет? И стоит по этому поводу кому-то беспокоиться или нет? Потому что на этот вопрос до сих пор нет четкого ответа, по крайней мере, от руководства Израиля. Хотя всем, мне кажется, в этом зале и за пределами его, ясно, что Израиль является ядерной державой. Как это оценивать? Поэтому, мне кажется, если мы будем себя возбуждать перспективами превращения Ирана в ядерную державу, нам, конечно, необходимо сделать все для того, чтобы Ирану не потребовалось становиться ядерной державой. Но это вопрос взаимопонимания. Спасибо.
So is Israel a nuclear power or not?
The gentleman told you that you never heard an answer for this question from an Israeli leader, so you won't have it now.
So you're not going to make news,
No,
right?
I'm not going to make news, but I just want to say there is one difference. Israel never, ever threatened the national continuity of existence or existence of any other neighbor. Israel is the only country on earth probably where more than one leader says, I didn't mention Khomeini, I mentioned Khamenei, who is the real leader. You have to bear in mind, we look at Ahmadinejad and now Rouhani and say, what's a big difference? It's not a big difference, it's just the general manner. The supreme leader is Khamenei, is still the same, extremely kind of radical. Now, of course it has to do with the nature of the country. If Switzerland will wake up one morning and will find that Switzerland turned nuclear, or Sweden, I can promise you in advance that Israel will not raise its voice to make anything of it. And of course we don't question the big powers, but when players like the Iranians turn nuclear, that's extremely dangerous, because what's the lesson for any third-rate dictator? If you're strong enough at home, however iron fist you need to suppress your own people, if you are strong enough, you can defy the whole world and turn nuclear, exactly like the Pakistanis did and the North Koreans. And that's a very bad message, because 70 years after Project Manhattan, no one can secure the technicalities from being taken over by any modern country.
Mr. Barak, just to make a point here, you said you would not be against Sweden or Switzerland having nuclear weapons. Are you saying that you're not against nuclear proliferation?
No,
it depends what country has it?
No, I think that the effort to reduce, to kind of put under control the nuclear proliferation is extremely important. I didn't say to encourage Switzerland or Sweden to do it.
You said you wouldn't be worried by it,
No,
right?
I said if we would have wake up one morning and learn that that's what happened, Israel will not be the one to kind of protest.
All right, let's hope we don't wake up one morning with that news.
Yeah, you won't,
okay?
but I want to, you mentioned nuclear proliferation. There is no way to hold a world stable, non-proliferation regime if Iran will get over this threshold and become nuclear power. This will be
I'm going to
the
give
last
you
one.
the word. I just wanted to tell you one thing, Mr. Barak. I spent 10 days in Iran trying to get an interview from some of the leaders, which was not possible, didn't work out. But I then met with intellectuals who don't like the regime at all. And I asked, do you think your government wants to have nuclear weapons? And you know what they said to me? They said, we don't really know, but we certainly hope so. I said, well, why do you hope so? They said, look, the Russians have them, the Americans have them, the Brits, the French have them, the Israelis we know have them, China has them, North Korea has them, Pakistan has them, and India has them. Why can't we? And if you're going to tell them, well, it's because we don't like you, or because you threaten Israel, that really is not going to impress them. And these are intellectuals who don't like the regime. It's a complicated issue. Let me just put it that way. Sir.
Just 2 quick points. I just want to...
And then I
sorry.
have to point my finger like that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes. 2 quick points.
I just want to say that Israel and Iran were very good friends till '79. And number 2, I don't think the Palestinians would agree that Israel does not threaten anyone.
Sir, all the way down, the last gentleman.
Right.
And then you.
Thank you very much. Oh,
No, not you.
said all the way around.
Yes. Mr. Al-Yazal, go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. You know that Egypt hasn't got a diplomatic relation with Iran for the last 35 years. It's the only nation in the earth which we don't have a diplomatic relation with them for the last 35 years. But having said that, we definitely disagree. I'm talking about individual Egyptian politician. I'm not talking about Egypt, because I'm not authorized to talk about that, but it's my personal idea, that we have to stop Iran definitely from creating a nuclear head, that's for sure. Having said that, because this is maybe a threat to the area, threat to Israel, and at the same time we have a mutual border with Israel. If Israel is going to be hit by a nuclear head, it means Egypt definitely will be affected. So the idea is to stop everybody from playing with the nuclear head issue.
Okay.
Having said that, well, in Egypt as well, we believe that Israel has to be transparent in the nuclear issue, as well as the other part of the world, meaning that they can allow supervisors from the international international community to come and supervise what's in Israel, as well as that maybe Israel has to sign the treaty, because up till now Israel refuses to sign the treaty. I think if Israel, as Mr. Ehud Barak said, that they are not really playing or threatening anybody, so why don't you sign that treaty, and in the meantime you can give the entire world an impression that it is not a threat to anybody. Thank you.
Mr. Rizzo, yes?
Yes, well, I think that we have to be a little bit careful when we speak about weapons of mass destruction, because if we take it, from a nationalistic point of view, as we have a tendency to do sometimes, we take it from the wrong angle, I think. We can criticize Israel for not, admitting to have nuclear weapons, okay, but this is not really to me, the most important point. The most important point is that, the difference, because going back to the title of this conference, in fact, the difference between today's world and yesterday's world, especially if you are in a place like Kazakhstan, and you imagine, the kind of environment which existed here, perhaps even some decades ago, etc., is that, if we had a war at that time, you could kill people, it would be, something cruel, but it would not destroy the entire environment, Human beings will continue to live. What is clear today is, that mankind has the possibility to kill himself. We can, if there is a nuclear war, we will have no children. Nobody will probably exist at all. This is very important. So, okay, yes, there are a few countries having the nuclear bomb. Good, bad, I don't know. I mean, it's a fact. But I would do everything to avoid new countries to have it. From this point of view. Not, from the point of view that Iran is different from North Korea or Libya. I mean, this is not really so important to me.
Mr. Gingrich.
Yeah,
You have one over there as well. You have two.
I'll look your way first.
Okay.
Let me just say, I want to carry us back to the title of this panel and suggest that maybe it's a intellectually misleading approach, but absolutely one that the diplomatic community worldwide wants to take. I was very struck in the 90s in visiting Moscow and St. Petersburg and other places, the number of Russians who would say, we just want to become a normal country. And that had a general meaning to them of the rule of law, private property, physical safety. Well, this actually moves you in the opposite direction. What really struck me, and I was looking at being here in Kazakhstan, thinking about the long history of this region, we may be about to go back to a normal history. That is, we've had a couple of organizing cycles, the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, and they gave us an exaggerated sense of order. But in fact, we may not be drifting towards a new global order. We may be drifting towards a global technology and a global economy and sort of normal history. And normal history is lots of weird things happen, and they happen for a wide range of reasons. I was literally just kidding the other day about the degree to which North Korea is isolated, and as you know, in the last 3 days, the Russian parliament has taken an extraordinary step, may well actually indirectly open up North Korea in a totally different manner than I would have guessed. It would never have occurred to me that that could possibly happen. So you might actually end up with South Korean goods going north to the Trans-Siberian Railroad through North Korea with a Russian-built road. I mean, there are so many things happening that are outside any coherent sense of order. And that's a sense what Ehud Barak was saying about what's happening in the Middle East. I mean, you look at the tension, if you go and talk to the Saudis, Israel's not anywhere near the top 6 of their concerns. I mean, they now have so many concerns they didn't plan to have 10 years ago, and they're multiplying. And I think that's sort of where we are. And I think that we actually need a new language, because we're not going to, I believe, we're not going to get back to a new global order, because you're not going to have any ability to have a large enough center of power to force coherence. And you're going to have, everybody has their own interests and everybody has their own pursuits. And in a sense, and Kazakhstan sort of illustrates this, being very cautious and making the fewest enemies possible may be, in fact, the wisest strategy for the next 20 years for almost everybody, because none of us understand how all of these different power centers are going to evolve, or what they're going to be prepared to do.
But don't you think that 45 years of Cold War have affected the minds and the outlooks of so many people that when something happens that you call weird, and which I would agree with, it automatically is put within that framework and looked at from that viewpoint. So, aha, they're going back to doing this, or they're doing that, and we always knew they would. And this works out in different ways, and Ukraine is just one example where the Russians say, you can never deal with the Americans. They don't like us. They want to take Ukraine away from our sphere of influence. They've always tried to do that, and the American side says, see, they're going back to being Soviet, Putin is, and so on. So that new challenges are looked at from an old viewpoint.
Sure, I'd make 3 quick examples. The Edwardian model for Great Britain survived well into the 20s and 30s. They're out using aircraft to try to police Iraq. They're grotesquely overextended. Their plans for Singapore are absurd and lead to probably the biggest single military catastrophe in British history. Because, as you said, you have a lot of old guys with old ideas thinking about the world that used to be, and it's too painful to recognize how much has changed. Second, if you go out in a country as young as Kazakhstan, you're going to find that there is an entire generation out there that has no idea what the Cold War was. I mean, as a conservative Republican who loved Ronald Reagan, it is really sobering to realize how few American voters remember. I mean, all these younger voters go, that was ancient history. Was that like in the Civil War? Or when was this guy president? I mean, you know, and so what you're going to see is 2 things. You have an elite which has learned a history which now becomes its trap. And the elite keeps trying to reapply this history as though we were, this is a huge problem in Washington in both parties, okay? You have a younger generation which has not yet heard very much, which wonders why all this stuff is so stupid, and looks at their leadership and says, why are you doing that? And then third, you have distributed centers of power. I mean, nobody in Pyongyang gets up and worries about the Washington Post and the New York Times. True. They have their own game. They're playing it for their own reasons. My guess is we don't have a clue what it is, despite having studied them now since 1950. And I don't think the Chinese and the Russians have a clue either. And so we ought to have, I guess I'm calling for sort of a modest retrenchment intellectually that at least allows us to think about the possibility that we have re-entered normal history, and that in normal history there's not a coherent organizing principle or system, even though commercially and technologically you're going to see lots of systems emerge.
Let me add to it that I believe that...
just hold on. Did someone address me? I can't hear you. Here's the way this is going to work. We have another 10 minutes of discussion here, and then we throw it to you. I thought you were aware of the that you had a schedule. Okay, so don't worry.
I want to add to it to the elites that Speaker Gingrich mentioned, who studied history. I would like to draw attention not for 100 years ago, World War I, but 200 years ago. next year, it's 200 years after the Congress of Vienna, end of the Napoleonic Wars, which a kind of Congress that through understanding of the delicate balance of powers which is needed among sovereigns while respecting each other's perspective and interest in terms of realpolitik led to a stable Europe for probably more than 60 years till Bismarck appeared. And I think that something similar has to happen right now. No power, not including the traditional superpowers, can now dictate or tackle a challenge on its own. No one. It's a clear gestalt. The whole world is gestalt. Everything depends on everything else. No one can solve any issue. So there is a need to develop a new intellectual approach that assume that the other player points of view is as legitimate and at least relevant as yours. And I cannot deny that I hear points of truth in the remarks that I got as a critic to myself. There is certain need to realize and internalize. We are one world. And it's about the media, you know, a relationship between politics, geopolitics and media. Media is extremely relevant. I look at big wars. We still think of terms of big wars, but nothing like World War I, when generals, sometimes dumb generals, sent millions to their deaths and no one even raised his voice. Or the Second World War, when ideologies could take over millions and send them to fight to life and death under impossible kind of circumstances. Now, with media, we know the battlefield is brought into every family, into every living room, and even with the toughest autocracies, it cannot be ignored. The media, the way that Al Jazeera or CNN or any other main network brings the realities of war and terror home, changes the latitude of leaders to take decisions. And it makes, together with another revolution in media, making everything personal. Unlike the situation where we were young kids, where we all were kind of atoms, small elements of something much greater and bigger than ourselves, namely our nation, its greatest cause. We are now individuals, and even the most kind of self-confident autocrat should take into, probably except for North Korea, has to take into account what his people are thinking about. All these elements will change forever the kind of latitude for development.
Let me make a point. We are about to have an uprising in this hall. I've been told that there are many people who brought weapons here and who want to speak. So I'm going to ask you to just sit here and answer questions that come from all of the participants. I'm going to get up over here to the podium to see the hands, and will point my finger at whoever's going to ask the question. All right. Could I have some sound here? Thank you. Who wants to start? Sir, go ahead.
Вы знаете, Евразийский медиафорум становится главной площадкой, где презентуются и апробируются самые современные, самые главные идеи, которые могут привести к лучшему миру. И тема первого заседания называется «Новый мировой порядок». Конечно, по всем меркам Израиль не является совсем большим государством. Но от действия Израиля практически зависит очень многое в становлении и в качестве будущего мирового порядка. Израиль занимает ключевое место в формировании мировой политики, и от лидеров Израиля очень многое зависит. Мы вправе сегодня были ожидать от одного из лидеров Израиля более честного ответа, более справедливого подхода, более объективной оценки ситуации. Только что на глазах у всех была спекуляция по поводу высказывания духовного лидера Ирана Али Хаменеи о том, что он якобы сказал, что Израиль нужно стереть с лица земли. Или господин Барак не совсем точно знаком с цитатой, или просто-напросто налицо искажение сути предложения духовного лидера. Ахмадинежад, конечно же, не является ангелом, но он всего лишь процитировал слова духовного лидера о том, что страна, которая строится на идее несправедливости, не имеет будущего. И будущее просто, в этом будущем не будет места такой стране. Теперь о самом главном.
Вы, простите, я вас перебью.
Одну секунду буквально.
Я вас перебью, потому что я хочу и вам сказать, и всем остальным. Если у вас есть вопрос, будьте любезны его задать, а не выступать.
И вот вопрос задаю.
Пожалуйста, будьте любезны.
Руководство Израиля практически на нагнетание ситуации, на стремлении сделать из Ирана монстра, практически продвигает свой интерес и свои идеи. Как ни странно, сделать из Ирана монстра выгодно и Израилю, и Соединенным Штатам,
Вопрос.
и некоторым странам арабского мира. И вот у меня вопрос. К чему, господин Барак? Пора же признать, что вы, собственно говоря, являетесь ядерной державой. И почему, если вы являетесь ядерной державой, не подписываете договор о нераспространении ядерного оружия? И к тому же, почему тогда вам положено иметь или можно иметь ядерное оружие, а другим странам нет? Хотя эти страны декларируют на самом серьезном уровне, что такого оружия нет, даже нет стремления к движению обладания этим оружием.
Thank you very much. Mr. Barak, there were 5 questions asked. I'd like you to pick one and answer it.
I can't see very clear facing these lights, but is it Mr. Safarov who asked? Yes. So I want to tell the audience that Mr. Safarov is the head of a body deployed, I believe, in Moscow, who is responsible for encouraging the relationship and probably commercial relationship, otherwise an understanding between Russia, Iran, and the world. So he spoke from, you know, there is a saying in English where you stand depends on where you sit. It probably applies to a certain extent to all of us, but that's the reason for his eruption. I think I want to answer only practically one of it. Iran, as was already mentioned here earlier, was our Israel, best friend. We have nothing against the Iranian people. It's a great people with great history. We have something against the most radical tyranny that ever took over the Iranian people. And it will, I don't believe that this revolution will be with us another 40 years, or approaching their 40 years anniversary. They won't survive the third generations of Iranians, I hope. But that's up to the Iranian people. I don't believe that anyone on earth, not just Israelis, should think positively about a situation where such radical religious extremists with messianic apocalyptic visions will have at their disposal a nuclear military arsenal.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Sir, right here. Yes.
Спасибо. Я представляю Армению, и поэтому хочу сразу перейти к вопросу, конкретике. Вы не могли бы мне сказать, вы сами...
Кому вопрос адресован?
Вам всем, в том числе вам, ну как главному спикеру. Вам не кажется, что вы слишком глобализируете идею, скажем, вот программа, да, «Новый мировой порядок. Контуры мирового кризиса и его последствия», глобализируете ситуацию вокруг Ближнего Востока, Иран, Израиль и, скажем, даже Украина. Вам это так не кажется? Вы не видите ситуация, ухудшающаяся на Дальнем Востоке, вокруг, скажем, спорных островов, тех же Китай, Япония. Это не смешно, или это смешно? Или это не угроза миру? Вы не видите угрозы мировому порядку сегодняшнему, не будущему, в том, что падает, рушится экономика ведущих стран мира? Вот почему мы об этом не слышим обсуждения?
Anyone care to pick that up? Mr. Barak, would you just hold it 1 minute, or are you monopolizing the convention? Yeah. Anyone else? Mr. Zatulin, go ahead. And try to be brief, please.
Я думаю, все вы свидетели, что тут нет никакого заговора. Просто одна из тем, которая по воле нашего ведущего оказалась первой при обсуждении, вызвала большой интерес. А как всегда, когда возникает интерес, возникает детализация. Что касается мирового порядка, каким он мне представляется относительным весьма. После распада Советского Союза этот мировой порядок сопровождался такими событиями, как Югославия, Ирак, Ливия, и можем продолжать дальше. Считать ли это идеальным мировым порядком? Безусловно, это порядок, основанный на беспорядке, или, точнее говоря, на доминанте одной из сил, которая сочла себя победительницей. То, что произошло вот на наших глазах, я не знаю, является ли это поворотным пунктом, но в любом случае это приглашение задуматься о том, что на самом деле ни у кого в 21 веке нет этой монополии на то, чтобы определять, в чем состоит мировой порядок. Вот и все.
Sir, over there, yes. Mm-hmm. Do you have a microphone?
Thank you. This question is actually to Mr. Barak, dealing with the question of Hamas. First time I interviewed a Hamas leader, I said to him, why do you insist on carrying out terrorist activities? It just puts you in a bad light with the United States above everything else. And his answer to me was, what have we got to lose? So you mentioned Hamas refusing to recognize the state of Israel. If they do recognize you, they have no other bargaining chips. That's their final card.
I think the issue, once again, I agree with the people in the audience that think that we are drawing too much attention. I mentioned, I think that it's an important issue, but not the most important issue on world arena now. But I will answer you briefly. There is a lot to negotiate. We have to negotiate all the core issues. We have to negotiate borders, we have to negotiate refugees, we have to negotiate security, we have to negotiate Jerusalem, and we have to negotiate the end of conflict and finality of claims. The recognizing Israel is basically at the first stage, recognizing the fact that there is a state called Israel. It's not a vacuum there. And later on, during negotiation, once they leave terror and put behind them terrorist activities, once they recognize, once they agree to all the agreements which were signed by the Fatah, by Abu Mazen and Arafat all along the years, I think that they will be in a different position, at least in the eyes of the United States. I don't think that nothing to lose is a real recipe for a better future for the Palestinians and the Gazans.
I see no more hands out there.
A lady over there.
Oh, yes, please. Right over there, yes. Go ahead.
Александра Коневская, РБК. Вы вначале упомянули о том, что одной из тем этой дискуссии будет Украина. Все же очень хотелось бы услышать позицию Ньюта Гинриджа и Константина Затулина, как ситуация на Украине повлияет или уже влияет на мировой порядок. Спасибо.
So there's a question for both Mr. Gingrich and Mr. Zatulin. You want to start? Mr. Gingrich.
Well, this is a good example of what I meant about returning to normal history. Clearly, and I think it's a very interesting thing to remember that President Putin spent an immense amount of money on Sochi to create a Winter Olympics for global consumption designed to maximize Russian prestige, and pivoted within days and managed to remind everybody of why prestige may not be enough by getting deeply involved in Crimea in a way that at one level one can sympathize with. I mean, Crimea has historically been Russian. It became Ukrainian by an accident of Nikita Khrushchev doing something that clearly had no legally binding principle outside of the Soviet dictatorship. And I think, while I think the election was somewhat rigged, I suspect in an honest, fair referendum, something like 65% of the people of Crimea would vote to join Russia. So there was a case there. Now, notice that Putin basically erased all of the goodwill of Sochi, pivoted and said, let me go back to being a normal power. And he clearly has the Ukrainians at a triple disadvantage. One, there is no possibility the Ukrainians can militarily fight the Russians with any hope of success. Two, they still depend overwhelmingly on Russia for energy, and they owe the Russians a lot of money, and therefore he is in a position to continually play games with their economy and weaken their government and undermine it. And three, there are enough links that are there that are, whether you think they're put there by deliberate effort on the Russians' part or they just grew naturally, there are enough ties in eastern Ukraine that it's going to remain a mess. Now, my hope is that this will all gradually just fizzle out and that Putin will be willing to accept a substantially weaker Ukraine that understands the limits of its independence and as our former Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, said, he's not giving back Crimea. I mean, so all these Western, the Western posturing, the strong language, all of the various demonstrations of intent, there's no possibility we're going to bring enough pressure to bear on Moscow for Putin to give up Ukraine. I mean, I think there's some part of foreign policy and national security that has to start with reality. We can't put enough pressure on Russia for him to accept a defeat in Ukraine. And so I think the best we can hope for is that we end up muddling through without too much more happening and getting to some kind of very nervous balance. What I worry about is that he would at any point go north and decide to play the same game in Estonia, because then you have a real problem. Because Estonia is a member of NATO, and then we would feel treaty-bound to respond. And the Estonian border is about 148 miles from St. Petersburg. So I think it is one of the most dangerous places in the world. And I just think both sides have to take a deep breath and be very careful not to stumble into something that we can't control.
Mr. Zatulin?
Я очень благодарен господину Гингричу за сдержанность и добрые чувства. Хотя, я думаю, есть одна фундаментальная ошибка в рассуждениях. Это, конечно, не число процентов, отданных за возвращение Крыма в Россию, не 65, а 95, от 83% участников, если говорить о явке. Главная ошибка не в этом. Главная ошибка в том, что мы выпячиваем, и уже не первый раз в ходе замечаний, которые здесь звучали на этой конференции, Крым как некое самостоятельное абсолютное явление. В прежние времена у нас было модное выражение нашего основоположника прежнего нашего государства, о том, что если мы будем каждый раз обсуждать частные вопросы, не обсудив общих, то каждый раз, сами того не подозревая, вольно или невольно, будем натыкаться на этот общий вопрос. Одно простое соображение. Если господин Путин так много денег потратил на мой родной город Сочи, в котором я прожил 20 лет и очень ему благодарен за то, что он потратил деньги на этот город и проведение Олимпиады, то, наверное, это должно было бы привести к мысли всех нас, что он не планировал на следующий день после Сочи конфликтовать в Украине. Он совершенно не собирался этого делать. В молодости я читал книгу Барбары Такман «Августовские пушки». Точка зрения Барбары Такман, кстати, эта книга была настольной книгой президента Кеннеди в момент Карибского кризиса. Госпожа Такман писала о том, что никто не хотел Первой мировой войны из лидеров тогдашних государств. Но обстоятельства привели к тому, что эта война разразилась. Она считала, что всей виной недостаток коммуникации между ними тогда. Что касается происшедшего с Крымом и на Украине. На Украине кризис, безусловно. Он начался не в связи с Крымом. И задолго до того, как возникла эта тема. Крым всегда был проблемой в российско-украинских отношениях, потому что, как верно сказал господин Гингрич, это был такой заминированный подарок, который сдетонировал в этих обстоятельствах. Все эти 20 лет официальная Россия удерживалась от того, чтобы воспринять голоса, которые идут из Крыма. Я-то знаю, что эти голоса всегда были. И вы можете убедиться по тому, каким образом прошел этот референдум, что они на самом деле не подтасованы, они не фальшивы. Но что произошло? Произошло то, что кто-то перешел красную черту. Понимаете, когда нам говорят о том, что мы учитываем ваши интересы, что мы понимаем ваши озабоченности, мы склонны верить. Но когда говорят одно, а делают другое, тогда происходит нечто похожее на то, что произошло с Украиной. Понимаете, у нас один из наших классиков литературы когда-то сказал, если на клетке с тигром висит надпись «Заяц, не верь глазам своим». Вот я не верю глазам своим, когда говорят, мы хотим учесть ваши обеспокоенности, но мы придумываем программу «Восточное партнерство», единственный смысл которой не дать ни в коем случае, чтобы Евразийский союз состоялся с участием Украины и других государств постсоветского пространства, потому что возникает призрак Советского Союза. Я сейчас не буду говорить, мы не создаем Советский Союз в Евразийском Союзе, об этом нет никаких мыслей. Но вопрос в том, что само по себе желание нас каким-то образом организовать это пространство, оказывается, является просто предосудительным. Надо придумать что-нибудь, чтобы этого не допустить. Вот что было корнем событий на Украине, потому что они развивались по этому сценарию. Как только действующий президент в последний момент рванул стоп-кран, я его не оправдываю, не хочу сейчас говорить о его достоинствах и недостатках. Сразу возникло известные события на Майдане. Да, конечно, они вызваны были внутренними причинами. Но кто здесь в зале может, положа руку на сердце, сказать, что не было никакого внешнего вмешательства во все эти события? Перечислить тех людей, которые ездили и увлекали Майдан к тому, чтобы он вел себя так, как он себя вел. Понимаете? И после того, как произошел переворот на Украине, который назвали революцией, тут началась другая совершенно история, к которой господин Путин совершенно точно не готовился. Он вынужден был реагировать в соответствии с тем, что происходило.
Спасибо. Спасибо. Да, вы. Да. Дама. Да.
My question is to the US.
Would you keep the microphone up?
As the sole superpower, what do you see your country doing to resolve, or at least superficially resolve, the issues plaguing this part of the world, keeping in view what Mr. Wali Nasser has written in his book, The Dispensable Nation? Is the US going to take a clear stance on things, or is it going to be one thing for one country and the other solution for another one perspective for Egypt, another one for Israel, one for Pakistan, one for India? What do you think is going to be the role of the US in 2014 and from this time onwards?
Well, it's a very good question, and you are sort of making the point I tried to make earlier. I don't think we are the sole superpower. I think that there is no hegemonic power on the planet. I think that the period of massive American advantage has been dramatically shortened. I don't think you can look, for example, at the size of the Chinese economy, just to take one example, or look at the collective growth of Latin America and particularly of Brazil, and turn around and say that the U.S. is the power that it was even 20 years ago. We still have enormous military strength, but as we proved in the last 15 years, military strength is a very limited capability. The president said the other day that we had military superiority over Russia. And I'm in the process of writing an article just saying, what does that mean? I mean, if you're dealing with a power that has 1,700 strategic nuclear weapons, and you're dealing with a power that clearly would have decisive advantages in the Black Sea, what does military superiority mean? We're not going to put aircraft carriers in the Black Sea. I doubt if Turkey would let them go through the Dardanelles. And if they got through the Dardanelles, what would you do with them? And I think we really have to back up. And I'm for the United States for understanding that we are probably the leading power on the planet, but we are a long way from being a superpower in the sense that we were in 1992, 1993, or the economic superpower we were in 1945. Remember, at the end of World War II, 50% of the gross domestic product of the entire planet was in the United States because everybody else had been bombed. So we were historically at a weird moment when we were enormous. We're not enormous. We're big, but we're not enormous. And I think we have to have a whole new foreign policy that takes into account all of these countries, all of whom have their own interest and all of whom operate in their own culture. And we have to have a little respect and a little humility in trying to find ways to form coalitions. And part of what Obama's tried to do is not bad. I mean, I don't think he does it very well, but he at least has this instinct that we should try to find a way to work together and to create, and it's not just creating coalitions of the willing that the United States walks in and says, would you like to join us? It's also going to mean the United States walks in a lot and listens and tries to figure out what the rest of the world's trying to get done. And I don't think today we're prepared to deal with complexity on that scale. So I don't think we are a superpower in the sense that people mean it. And this is part of what I was trying to say a while ago. I think people got to really re-gear their brain to think in very significantly different ways about how the next 30 or 40 years are going to work.
Gentleman over there, yes.
Basel Khadjasem, телеканал Al-Arabiya. Мой вопрос к вам, Владимир Владимирович.
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Как вы смотрите на мнение, которое говорит, что вот Иран, Израиль, угрожение друг друга, это просто для внутреннего потребления. Убегают они от своих внутренних проблем. Потому что когда была серьезная угроза, мы знаем, что Израиль 30 лет назад, только начинающие еще идея про ядерную программу в Ираке, они сразу бомбили. И теперь, что происходит в арабский мир, это для оба их идет на пользу. И всегда израильский центр стратегический публикует, что десятки израильских компаний или иранских непосредственно работают в обеих странах. Спасибо.
Ну, раз вы спросили по-русски, я отвечу по-русски. Я отвечу очень коротко. Вот этот мир, о котором вы говорите, арабский мир, арабские, израильские вопросы, это на самом деле совсем не мой регион. И я не люблю говорить о вещах, в которых я недостаточно хорошо разбираюсь.
Я про Иран говорю, между Израилем и Ираном, что это угрожение между собой, это просто для внутреннего потребления.
Я не думаю. У меня нет ощущения после пребывания и в той, и в другой стране, в Иране, правда, только один раз, в Израиле много раз, у меня нет ощущения, что это надуманная политическая игра, стремящаяся отвлечь, скажем, народ от насущных задач. У меня этого ощущения не было. Но я вам это говорю на уровне ощущений, и не более того. Я не являюсь экспертом по этим странам. Yes, right there.
Can I?
Who, where, what?
Here, sir.
Go. Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
First of all, I have a very brief comment. I think an entity which is based on occupation has no moral authority to advise the others. An entity which poses 200, at least, nuclear weapon is in no position to talk about the other. But my question is about the topic of the panel. The panel is about world order. We hear so much about U.S. pivot from the Middle East to Asia. I didn't hear anything in this panel. May I address my question to Mr. Sikri, to Mr. Zultin, and Mr. Gingrich that how do you see the American pivot from the Middle East to Asia? Is it real? Is it not real? Is it possible or is it impossible? Thank you.
Gentlemen, who goes first?
Look, I think press secretaries meet with politicians to invent good phrases that they hope will get them through the next press conference. Pivot to Asia was, I think thought up at the State Department. I used to tell people when we first went into Iraq that we could guarantee a stable democracy in Iraq, and we would not have to stay a day longer than we've been in South Korea. My father fought in South Korea in 1953. We have had American forces in South Korea now for 64 years. We have American forces in Japan. The Filipinos, in response to Chinese aggressiveness, are eagerly inviting us back to a country we first visited in 1898. The Vietnamese have decided that we might be better neighbors than the Chinese, even if our neighborhood is San Diego. We never left. I mean, this idea we're going to pivot, we're not going to leave the Middle East. We're not going to leave Europe. One of the great problems the United States has is we are only interested in countries which have produced American citizens. So if you can find me a country that has not produced an American citizen, I can show you a country we won't care about. Now, to the best of my knowledge, there's not a single country on the planet that doesn't have somebody in Los Angeles. And that's just a reality. And so we are a world power. We're not a superpower, but we are a worldwide power. We have to worry about the entire planet. And my concern is that we don't integrate this. I mean, you have to understand that to the degree that we're clumsy in Syria or to the degree that we're clumsy in Ukraine, it directly affects how Beijing thinks about what they can do. And the world is very complicated. And we don't have any models for how a nation manages foreign policy on this scale of complexity. But I think the pivot to Asia was greatly oversold. There are certain military characteristics of Asia that are different. You have to have longer-legged aircraft, et cetera. We're thinking through the problem of containing the Chinese, no matter how good their anti-ship missiles get. But that stuff's just trivia. That's bureaucracy. I mean, you hire thousands of people to think about stuff like that. The President of the United States gets up every morning and gets a briefing on the planet. He doesn't get a briefing that says, this week we're only going to look at Asia. And I think this is, frankly, an enormous challenge. We don't do it particularly well. We may do it as well as anybody ever has, but we don't do it particularly well because nobody has. But we are not leaving the Middle East. We're not leaving Europe. We're not leaving Africa, where we've actually created an African command. We will have people virtually everywhere doing something on a scale that I think actually 10 years from now, only China will match us. But China has the population and the wealth. The Chinese will be virtually everywhere that we are.
Yes? No, hold on, gentlemen.
Well,
yes.
I think the problem is that the Americans, as Mr. Gingrich has pointed out, feel that they have global interests. Why they feel that way, that's another question. But the point is that these global interests often come into conflict with regional interests and local interests. How do you reconcile them? The second is the American belief born out of their history, which is a rather short one, 200-odd years, of exceptionalism. They think they're exceptional, but everyone thinks they're exceptional. And most empires have felt that way, that they were exceptional. Be it Genghis Khan, be it the Ottomans, be it the British, everyone thought that they were exceptional. Now, you cannot impose on the rest of the world your own values and principles. Everyone thinks differently. There are no universal values in that sense. And then you say, oh, but you don't agree with me, we're going to sanction you. We're going to blackmail you. We're going to control you through the institutions of international finance that we have. See what's happening to Iran. So all this creates a situation where most countries feel helpless. There's no global set of rules, notwithstanding the United Nations. There's only the might is right principle. And you have Of course, when it suits you, then it's okay, that, self-determination, humanitarian interventionism and so forth. When it doesn't, then the dictators are very good. Some countries get lectures on morality, on democracy. Others, the dictators are the best friends. So this is what creates the problem. And I think that if you have any country which is trying to globally dominate and which is trying to prevent the emergence of countervailing blocs, you will have an intense, inherently tense situation that is fraught with possible conflict.
Mr. Rizzo, yes.
Well, I think that perhaps this is a good occasion to say something a little bit more systemic in our conversation, because I don't think that there are pivots of any kind anywhere in the world. I think that we live really in a fluid world, as it has been said before, and as many scholars are telling us. There are many books on that. It's not so new what I'm saying. So it's no one's world in a way, but it's also everybody's world in another way. So you can also look at that in an optimistic way. And the systemic fix I want to say is the following. We had a G7 for a long time, still exists, but it's not so important as it used to be. Then we had, about 7 or 8 years ago, I don't remember, the first meeting of the G20, and we thought it was a very good thing because it brought to the world more representation, which is true, of course, because the G20, which in fact is 25, I think, or something, is much better than G7 because it represents much more of the world. On the other hand, this is representation, is not governance. And I think the issue that it was on the table before was really that the fact we don't have a model. We don't have a model of governance. It has been said here by many of us, the only kind of model we can think of, in perspective, is to have more respect for the values of other people and more respect for the interests of other people and more empathy and much more of a network. And this forum is a good example of that, by the way. Mr. Barak was speaking before about the concept of nations, but the concept of nations worked in Europe in the 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars to a certain extent, but we have also to remember that it was a much smaller world where there were few actors. So in a way it was easier to have, 10 or 12 actors, getting together some kind of agreement. Now we are living in a planet where we have 7 billion individuals, and we know that the power of governments is also declining, that we have much more power in individuals, we have much more non-governmental networks. So to run all of that, this is much more difficult and much more interesting, by the way, and much more challenging. And I think really our goal should be that. It's not so much, about Ukraine. There will be so many Ukrainians in the future, We have just, as I say, to treat them in normal way, to establish some principles, For instance, you don't use force, you don't change the borders unilaterally, this kind of principles. And then for the rest, you have just to compromise, to negotiate. This is the only recipe, I am Italian, and I come from a nation which was at war for centuries with all the neighbors, like everybody else in the world. And which is not a good history, but it's our history. And in fact, the European Union, which is so much criticized today because it has not achieved its goal in the currency, etc., is, to my mind, a model, a model to be followed elsewhere in the world. Because today, people will laugh in the streets if you say there is a war between France and Germany or Italy and England. It's unbelievable. We are thinking, how to unite ourselves. So I think this kind of regional integration and networking, in a vague way, if you like, but this is a sense of direction where we have to go. This is my contribution to the discussion.
Mr. Al-Ghazal?
Very quickly, a quick comment. In fact, Mr. Gingrich mentioned correctly the issue in Korea. I believe it is a very hot issue. I have been working in our embassy in North Korea for a few years in Pyongyang, and I know the issue quite well. I think the world has to pay more attention to the Korean Peninsula issue. I think it's getting hotter, and it's getting dangerous as well by trying to show the world the capability of rockets and missiles and the increasing the range of missiles and the trials every now and then, as well as the nuclear issue. So I believe 100%, as you mentioned, that talking about the global problems, I think the world has to pay more attention to the Korean issue. Thank you.
Mr. Zatulin, you wanted to make a point?
Ко мне адресовали вопрос, поэтому... Ну, я, во-первых, хотел бы по вопросу о том, переносят ли американцы тяжесть или внимание с Ближнего Востока на Азию. Здесь я прибегаю к поправке Познера, который сказал, что я не эксперт в этом вопросе. Мне кажется, что американцы давным-давно внимание проявляют к Азии, и лишнее тому подтверждение те прекрасные слова, которые сегодня не раз говорил господин Гингрич о Казахстане. Я просто позавидовал его красноречию. Он прекрасно говорил об Астане, прекрасно говорил о Казахстане. Это речь человека, который внимательно относится к происходящему в этой вот части мира, в Евразии и в Азии конкретно. А что касается модели мирового порядка, о котором только что говорил наш итальянский коллега, говорил о том, что вот она требуется или ее нет, то, мне кажется, надо в этом случае привлечь здравый смысл. Говорят, что в лондонском метро обратили внимание, что число самоубийств, к сожалению, случающихся, возрастает потому, что на дверях висит табличка «Выхода нет». Их заменили на слова «Выход с противоположной стороны», и число самоубийств уменьшилось.
Just hold on a minute. There's a gentleman way back there. Yes, yes, yes. I mean, yes, the gentleman standing up. There you go.
Здравствуйте, дамы и господа, уважаемые руководители и участники этого прекрасного форума. Я представляю Грузию, моя фамилия, имя Заза Мезуришвили, я независимый журналист. И мне вопрос будет господину Затулину. Вы, господин Затулин, сказали, что вы 20 лет слышите голоса крымского народа, которые хотят соединиться к России. А почему вы 20 лет не слышите голоса чеченского народа, который признал свою независимость по референдуму и до сих пор является и в Российской Федерации? Или вы только поддерживаете тех, которые хотят присоединиться к России, а не слышите голоса тех, которые хотят отсоединиться от вас? Спасибо большое.
Спасибо. Прежде всего хочу сказать вам в отношении Крыма следующее. Зря вы сомневаетесь. В Крыму был проведен один раз референдум в 1991 году. Это, кстати, был первый референдум в Советском Союзе. После этого был референдум о Союзе, референдум на Украине. Тот референдум, о котором я говорю, был проведен в январе 1991 года, за год до его распада. И примерно такое же количество людей, что и сейчас, проголосовали тогда на референдуме за повышение статуса Крымской области до республики и за прямые отношения между этой республикой и Москвой. То есть, по сути, проголосовали за выход из состава Украинской ССР, раз прямые отношения в рамках нового союзного государства. После этого 20 лет принимались усилия для того, чтобы не допустить никакого референдума в Крыму. Это факт, и можете его трактовать как хотите, но я-то знаю причину этого. Причина заключается в том, что это была абсолютно подавляющая точка зрения в Крыму. Что касается Чечни, но мне кажется, вы ошибаетесь. Мы в 90-е годы, заключив с Чечней, которая с нами воевала в составе России, была война это или, как у нас говорили, контртеррористическая операция, подписали в Хасавюрте мир, по которому фактически у Чечни возник этот самый статус, не очень определенный, но, по крайней мере, сами руководители тогдашней Чечни были очень удовлетворены им. Речь шла о строительстве ими самостоятельно, без вмешательства со стороны России, основ своего государства. Это строительство сопровождалось крупнейшими катаклизмами в самой Чечне, выбросом населения из Чечни. И в конце концов завершилось тем, что Чечня напала на соседний Дагестан. И это случилось в 1999 году. После этого история начала раскручиваться в обратную сторону. И если вы хотите сейчас провести референдум, это можно сделать. Уверяю вас, референдум в Чечне дал бы совершенно иные результаты. Если у вас есть в этом сомнения, я вас приглашаю. Приезжайте, пожалуйста, в Чечню. Приезжайте в город Грозный, который отстроен примерно, ну, может быть, менее амбициозно, чем Астана, но уж, по крайней мере, не напоминает собой тот город Грозный, который был до этих событий. Это совершенно точно. Поэтому то, что вы сейчас говорите про Чечню, это старая новость. Она уже не имеет оснований сегодня, она к реальности не имеет никакого отношения.
Thank you. The lady over here, yes. No, I said lady. Right.
Thank you very much, but I would like to go back to the question which has not been answered, neither by Mr. Gingrich nor by Mr. Zatulin. I represent an international organization, OSCE. I hope that everybody knows what's that about. The organization which is called exactly to avoid that kind of crises that we have now, or to try to avoid the conflicts. Я хочу перейти на русский, чтобы было понятно, что я тоже говорю хорошо на русском языке. Хотя я опять хотела вернуться к тому вопросу, на который вы не ответили. Прежде всего, это касается того, какие прецеденты могут быть по поводу того, что случилось в Украине, для всей территории ОБСЕ, по крайней мере. Если вы помните, принцип ОБСЕ – это неделимость безопасности. Не может быть безопасность в одном регионе, если есть опасность в другом регионе ОБСЕ. Вы, наверное, помните и другие 10 заповедей Хельсинского, так называемого заключительного акта, которые все, абсолютно все были нарушены последние 1,5-2 месяца. Извините меня, одним из самых главных членов нашей организации, вернее, участниц нашей организации. Я напомню, суверенитет, нерушимость границ, территориальная целостность, невмешательство в внутренние дела другого государства, не угроза силы и не применение силы, решение всех вопросов за столом переговоров, и главное, уважение к правам человека, равноправие стран и право на самоопределение, и последнее – международное сотрудничество, и самое последнее – исполнение всех международных обязательств и договоров. Так вот, я хотела спросить, вы говорите, что, вот только что вы упоминали, что будет много еще таких Украин, не должно быть Украин. Для этого наша организация и делает все, чтобы сейчас максимально решить проблему в Украине на принципах международного права. Если мы сейчас разрушим международное право, какой к черту новый порядок? Это будет опять старый порядок, когда мы вернемся в эпоху силы, когда тот, кто силен, тот и прав. Как можно вообще ставить такие вопросы, извините, я немножко эмоционально говорю, как можно вообще говорить спокойно о судьбе любого народа? Да, вот для нас это не важно. Извините, пожалуйста, это важно для всех нас, потому что сегодня Украина, завтра в любом месте. Какой референдум? Извините меня, я была в Канаде в 1995 году, когда готовился референдум по Квебеку. Я видела, сколько лет люди шли к этому референдуму, как много было обсуждений везде, на всех уровнях. И народ полностью, когда шел на референдум, знал, за что он голосует. Возьмите Барселону,
Простите, я вас
Каталонию,
перебью.
я прошу прощения.
Можно все-таки вопрос?
Да, вопрос у меня возвращается к тому же вопросу. Так все-таки будет иметь влияние для мирового порядка то, что произошло в Украине?
Спасибо.
Или не будет?
Спасибо.
Или мы будем считать, что квазиреферендум, который не признал никто, который неизвестно сколько людей проголосовало, это будет право для аннексии государства?
Спасибо.
Да, и последнее. Извините, немножко было эмоционально, потому что я украинский дипломат, хотя я работаю на ОБСЕ. И я очень хорошо знаю, что там было. И я тот человек, который может сказать, что внешнее влияние с российской стороны было большим. И господин Затулин 20 лет ездил в Крым и пытался оставить Крым нам горячей точкой. Спасибо большое. Так вот, я русскоговорящая украинка, и я не хочу, чтобы меня защищал Путин. Спасибо.
Пожалуйста. As I understand it, the question was addressed both to Mr. Zatulin, very emotionally, and to Mr. Gingrich, right? Is that correct? Вы и Затулину, и Гингричу.
Я хотела вернуться к этому вопросу, но мы уже слышали точку зрения господина Гингрича и господина Затулина. Я бы хотела, может быть, другие, может быть, и от вас услышать тоже, как от человека, который на российском телевидении представляет интеллектуальную силу. Спасибо.
Это странно. Что делать?
So now I'm going to say this in English. The lady says that she's heard your viewpoint, although I haven't heard it, because her question actually was, will what's happening in Ukraine affect the world order or not? That's basically what she's asking. So anyone who's sitting here can...
Я просто хочу сказать, вы не обижайтесь, только это очень по-украински. Вы задали вопрос по-русски, поскольку не хотели бы, чтобы я на него ответил. Все остальные русские просто не понимают, приходится господину Познеру объяснять всем остальным. Все-таки, если я, прошу прощения, я вынужден два слова сказать. Вы знаете, я не буду сейчас обращаться к вам как к представителю Украины, а буду обращаться так, как вы сами поставили вопрос, как представителю ОБСЕ. Все то, что вы сейчас так взволнованно сказали, действительно серьезное основание для ответа. Прежде всего хочу сказать, организация под названием ОБСЕ должна была бы быть так взволнована, когда в 1999 году при всяком попустительстве, отсутствии всякого внимания со стороны этой организации в центре Европы развязалась война против Югославии. Организация под названием ОБСЕ должна была быть взволнована, когда она без всякого референдума, ни одного референдума не было проведено в Косово, своими решениями признавала Косово и поощряла тех, кто его признает. Вы можете сказать, это разные вещи. На мой взгляд, это вещи, которые вытекают одни из другого. И хочу заметить, что все, что произошло с Крымом, произошло позже. Я оставляю сейчас как бы для нашего внутреннего дискурса разговор о том, было ли в самом деле в Крыму волеизъявление или не было это волеизъявление. По-моему, это очень трудно отрицать, что оно было. И, кстати говоря, лишнее доказательство, что это волеизъявление было абсолютно подготовлено не с точки зрения сроков, а с точки зрения всей предшествующей жизни, было то, что проголосовало такое количество людей. В конце концов, неужели кто-то может поверить, что 12, ну пусть 20 тысяч военнослужащих Российской Федерации, которые, кстати, по договору в тот момент находились в Крыму, что они в состоянии заставить 1,5 миллиона человек прийти на избирательные участки и каждому заставить сказать «да». Неужели это можно себе представить? Это же неправда. Это результат, к сожалению, очень многих обстоятельств, но главным образом, конечно, внутренних ошибок Украины. Напомню вам, что я закончу сейчас. В 1995 году, просто один эпизод, который, наверное, здесь уже мало кто помнит. В 1995 году Украина просто взяла и отменила действующую Конституцию Крыма и отменила избранного 80% крымчан президента. Это просто один из эпизодов для доказательства, как она действовала. Поэтому я тоже с вами согласен, что то, что происходит, должно быть основанием для переоценки ценностей, чтобы такого больше не произошло. Только речь не только о Крыме, а обо всем, что случилось вообще за это время. Потому что если вы будете выделять один Крым и не смотреть, что было до этого, то дальше я отсылаю вас к тому же вопросу. До тех пор, пока вы будете частные вопросы выдергивать, не решив общие, всегда будете натыкаться на эти общие вопросы. Спасибо.
Back to the question, will what's happening in Ukraine and is still happening, and nobody really knows what's going to happen tomorrow. Will that affect, and will what happened in Crimea affect the world order today? And if so, how? That basically was the question, as I understand it, and I think it's an important question. Anyone want to tackle that? Yes, sir, please.
You know, I'd like to make the general point that these problems are arising because we are not sufficiently recognizing the multicultural nature of states. There is too much majoritarianism. that whoever is a majority thinks that they can get away with it, and therefore the minorities need to get some protection in a state, which means firstly that there has to be a truly democratic framework within which all sections of society feel that they will have a fair deal. The problem is that we have borders that have been inherited, maybe colonial borders, but for want of anything else, these borders, even though they are artificial, have been retained. And if we are to have stability, then you have to evolve certain patterns, including more regional cooperation, because the aspirations of people cannot always be fulfilled within the framework of the nation state which has been inherited. So therefore, I think it calls for a little more sobriety, patience, and tolerance.
All right.
That is the point.
Let me make this very clear. Today in Ukraine, the southeast is controlled by people who are called separatists. You can call them whatever they want, but the southeast is controlled now by these people. You have in Kiev a government that some countries consider legitimate, some consider illegitimate. There is a real possibility that that government will use force against those in the southeast who are considered to be separatists. Should that happen, there is a great reality that Russia will use its troops to protect what it considers to be ethnic Russians in the southeast. So there could be a real military conflict. The question, I come back to it, should that happen, and with the story of what happened in Crimea, will that affect the present new world order? And if it will, how will it affect it? That's the question. Please.
I think the main issue is to call on leaders on both sides to make whatever they can in order to avoid it. Because if it will happen, if people en masse will be killed there, it will change the terms of the discourse, and many other points of tension will become much more critically dangerous. So it's clearly well understood by many Europeans. I believe that it's clearly understood by Putin, and I think that it will be understood also by the American administration. Any effort to avoid a direct clash should be put. And you mentioned the source of it as something that should happen within Ukraine, namely between the government in Kiev and what is called separatists on the east. So a major effort should be made by leaders to influence both the government in Kiev and others to find other ways, to count until 10, to try any other alternative of negotiation. Once again, even if Geneva failed, make once and again more and more effort to avoid direct clash. I believe that because of the understanding of the possible consequences, even the government in Kiev will be open-eyed and clearly with open ears to listen to such recommendations.
Anyone else have any thoughts on that? Mr. Rizzo, yes?
Well, I think that you are putting this question too much in a mechanical way, in the sense you said, the eastern part of Ukraine is controlled by people who want to be Russian. Will Kiev use force, and what will happen afterwards? I think there are many other ways this crisis can evolve, and we hope in a better way through dialogue and compromise. Because first of all, I don't know. I mean, I'm not so knowledgeable about Ukraine, but I don't think that Ukraine has really an army, capable of doing such things, as you mentioned, against a population which apparently goes in the other direction. So it seems to be, we are in a gray area there. And it seems to me that this crisis is too much dominated by emotions. Emotions, you know, the Russians thinking one way, I don't have to summarize, you have done that very well before. And if you slow down, I mean, and you calm down this atmosphere, this is the most essential, the most important thing, because it's a controversy which is one among many other controversies which will be again repeated in the world. So it's just a regional factor. It's not going to change the world order. This is my answer, unless it escalates into a major crisis, which I don't think will happen.
The lady down there, we have about 11 minutes left. I'm going to take 3 questions. Sir, you asked a question. I'm being democratic and giving everyone who hasn't asked a question the possibility. We'll take 3 questions from the audience, and then I'm going to ask the panel, each one of them, to give their final thoughts. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Ola, and I'm pleased to lead ISAC, which is world's largest youth organization. And I would like to ask you, because there was mentioned that, well, we are about to build a new order. So what do you think would be the role of youth in solving the problems which we pretty much don't understand anymore? And what kind of direction should we take as youth and the Generation Y? And then I would also like to ask you for advice. In a way, how can our voice be heard and in all this current order, especially taking into account that very often we're being told that we don't have enough experience, enough knowledge in order to, let's say, have our opinion well heard. Thank you.
Who are you addressing? You can't ask everybody.
I would like to then address, well, you as a person coming from media, and media is something we're struggling with. Yes.
All right.
And Mr. Gingrich.
I'll answer you very briefly.
Thank you.
First, don't trust people with gray hair. Second, get involved. Don't stay away. Don't say, oh, I don't want to get into politics. Get involved. Otherwise, you're not going to be heard. Those are the 2 things. And just remember, yours is the future. For us, ours is the past. It's for you to get involved. You have to be active. And don't ask us for advice. I think we've screwed up the world to such a point that we shouldn't be giving advice. That's my personal view. Sir.
Well, I think I disagree just a little bit. I think it's very useful to turn to lots of people for lots of advice and then sort it out. And I think it's very useful to study history, because the various and sundry ways in which humans do things tend to be repetitive. You can find examples throughout all of history, which accelerates your learning curve. But I would say you do have the great advantage that you don't carry the intellectual baggage of people who grew up in a different world. The world we're now entering does not resemble the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War. This is a different world with different centers of power, with different rules of the game. Nobody understands it. And I suspect somebody in your generation is as likely or more likely to figure out the operating principles of this new system as anybody over 40 is, because I think there's a tremendous amount of clutter. People who know a great deal often know things that no longer apply, but they use the things they know because that's what they know. And so they end up, it's almost as though you knew how to drive a car and now we put you in an airplane and you keep looking for the road. And we keep trying to explain, no, you're flying. And I think your generation is going to have the largest period of creativity we've seen in a very long time, or we're going to be in an even bigger mess.
The lady down there.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm from Ukraine. My name is Yulia Dros, so I represent youth, so I'm getting involved. I'd like to make 3 amendments just to make the issue clear.
Could you just ask a question, please?
And put a question. Crimea historically belongs to Crimean Tatars. That's the first thing. The second thing is real number of pro-Russian voices in Ukraine is about 34%. And the third thing, in 2010, Russia adopted new military doctrine which says Russia may apply force to defend Russian-speaking people. How many Russian-speaking people live in Kazakhstan, for example, in Astana, in Khakassia, in Israel, by the way, Mr. Barak? That's a good question to think about. So proceeding from the above said, since we're in the media forum, during all these events in Ukraine, during last month, we faced with a huge amount of propaganda and lies from the Russian media. Since we're in the media forum, we should talk about the problem when media lies and disinform people. How can we fix that? Thank you.
Well, that's a statement. It's not a question. So thank you very much. I just would like whoever, the hand up in the back, that'll probably be the last question. I can't even see if it's a man or it's a woman, but yes.
Me.
That's you. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Всех приветствуем. И вопрос я хотел бы все-таки вернуться к главной теме. Это новый мировой порядок. Меня зовут Денис Карашев, я из Казахстана, журналист независимый. Все-таки не считают ли наши гости то, что новый мировой порядок это совсем не то, и что это всего лишь растиражированная средства массовой информации старый мировой порядок, и если же все-таки это новый, почему он начинается с ограничения прав и свобод журналистов, с введением законов по ограничению деятельности блогеров не только на территории России, но мы понимаем, что давление происходит и в США, и в Израиле, и почему гражданская журналистика находится под таким высоким давлением?
So briefly, why are bloggers and why is so-called civil journalism under great pressure? Let's just put it there and leave it there, and then I'm going to ask you to make your conclusions. Anyone want to tackle that? See, there are no journalists here, so they're not...
Let me just say...
Probably at least in the United States and Israel, and probably in other places,
Russia,
really in Italy or
yes.
even in Egypt, it's not true. There is no real censorship.
I'm very confused by the comment because I think any journalist in America who has any blog site they want to writes virtually anything they want to, no matter how absurd, inaccurate, false, or slanderous, and we just cheerfully move on. I mean, I think the volume of people who are self-proclaimed journalists who get to invent their own blog sites in America is presently going to match the number of people living in the country.
We experienced every day the attacks from the bloggers. It means that there is a freedom.
Mr.
Я
Zatulin?
просто хочу сказать, что увидите в этом свидетельство влияния блогеров, интернет-среды на мировые события, на события внутри каждой страны. Пока интернет был уделом кучки энтузиастов, это не оказывало какого-то влияния, никто не принимал никаких ограничивающих рамок. Теперь это стало мировым явлением, это формирует правительство, свергает правительство, устраивает перевороты в странах и так далее. Видимо, это признание этого факта, и государства, которые ищут... Я не хочу сказать, хорошо или плохо они поступают, но они ищут средства какой-то самозащиты, и в силу этого они вводят эти ограничения. Это просто следствие вашего влияния. Вот и все.
Thank you. All right, we have 5 minutes left, even less. I'm going to ask each of you, within the framework of 60 seconds, just to give your conclusions to this discussion. Let's start with you, sir, and then go down.
Right. I think the world has to pay attention now for a major issue, which I don't believe they do a lot in that one, which is terrorism. I think the world is facing a huge problem in the coming few years, which is terrorism. We have to put our hands together, the entire world, to fight terrorists and to fight terrorism, as it is a big danger now. It will face everybody. It's going to face only the Middle East, for instance, or somewhere else. But the world has to do more work and to jointly to face the terrorists.
Well, I would like to conclude on a different tone, because here we have been speaking about threats, about problems, about issues, about wars. I think that we have also to take a more optimistic view of the world, because I think the topic of the discussion is really the world order. So it's not only about crisis, it's also about optimism, the role of youth, the internet, the information. I think there are more healthy and wealthy people today than ever in the history of humankind, and more possibility to have information and to have a cultural access to history and to everything and to science. So this is very important. So I think that we have to look at the world in a positive way because we have been evolving, I think, in a positive way so far. So yes, the crisis and everything else, but if we are clever enough to have more cooperation, more understanding about the others, more respect than we are showing sometimes even in our question and answers here, perhaps we can overcome the difficulties.
Okay.
And I think that we have overcome so many difficulties in the past
Thank
that
you.
it is possible to do the same in the future.
Sir.
I'd just like to leave the thought that while the new world order is characterized by the collapse of communism, and communism in practice may have been a failure, the idea is not dead. The idea that people should have equality, justice, fairness, that I think is not dead. And it is because now in a globalized, technology-driven, interdependent world, there are more and more dispossessed people who have those aspirations, and they're not content to be just pushed aside. So that is the real challenge. The second point is that young people no longer have an ideal. In the 20th century, it was this: communism, socialism, workers' rights, trade union welfare. You know, that was the idea. What is the ideal today? So we must bring back some morality into our thinking.
Thank you. Господин Затулин.
Когда распадался Советский Союз, что обычно представляют этапом утверждения нового порядка, посткоммунистического порядка, у нас в России, в Советском Союзе был популярен тезис «так жить нельзя». То, что происходит сейчас, говорит о том, что за время, прошедшее с того момента, накопилось много противоречий, которые заставляют говорить то же самое. Так жить нельзя. Я очень надеюсь, что в результате всех этих событий мы все придем к каким-то новым правилам мирового общежития. Пусть вас не пугает то, что это происходит вот в таких конфликтах. Да, конечно, конфликты плохи сами по себе, но вы знаете, любая священная книга любой религии говорит о том, что вначале все-таки был хаос, и этот хаос потом стал преобразовываться. Поэтому есть какая-то надежда на то, что вот этому высокомерию, которое было отличительной чертой всего этого периода после 1991 года, когда одни знали, что правильно, а другие должны были слушать и воспринимать это, и не могли по этому поводу ничего, кроме как подчиняться и говорить «да, есть». Вот этому периоду приходит конец, и нужно понять всем, и тем, и другим, что кроме диалога ничего другого человечество никогда предложить не может. Спасибо.
I fully agree with my Egyptian colleague about the importance of identified challenge of terrorism, and with my Indian colleague about the challenge, immense challenge to the world order stemming out from inequalities between and probably more than this within societies. I would like to add two points. One about the American pivot, so to speak, if and when it happens to the East. I see when if America pivots to the East, they will see China filling the screen. But inevitably, with China, the Americans will have certain kind of symbiotic relationship. It's not going to be a huge clash. The issues of economy, trade, currency reserves, and exchange rates will make them inevitably cooperating. But underneath this umbrella of symbiotic relationship, there will be a lot of cases like the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands or the Koreas or Taiwan and the mainland and many other issues all around Chinese Sea. That is something that should be treated with a lot of attention because for different reasons, nationalism is on the uprise both in China, Japan, Koreas and many other corners, with a tone or an undertone which is extremely disturbing if it's not suppressed.
I really want to end on a very optimistic note. I think if you look at Astana, it's a perfect representation of a rising world system of technology. I mean, just look at the architecture, but also look at all the other characteristics of the city. This is a very advanced city. It's also a perfect example of the rising world system of commerce. Look at all the different companies that are represented here. Look at all the different opportunities there are for export industries. The challenge is that the political, diplomatic, governmental systems are going to be several generations behind the emerging technology and commercial worlds. And so a lot of the next 50 years, I think, is going to be spent muddling through. And it's going to involve injustice, and it's going to involve confusion, and it's going to involve sloppiness, because the truth is, we very seldom get political leaders or government bureaucrats clever enough to get this stuff solved neatly. And so a lot of stuff's going to be done at the last minute, not very well put together, with sloppy compromises. And there's going to be a tremendous amount of churning. The question is, can we keep those problems isolated enough and small enough that the technological and commercial world keeps growing? Because if it keeps growing, most of the inequality will be wiped out by rising middle classes, the scale of wealth will be unbelievable, and most people over the next 50 years in most countries will end up with dramatically longer lives with greater opportunities. That actually depends far more on the technology and the commerce, as long as the political systems don't totally screw them up. And I think so I'm not so much for a new world order as I am for a half century of muddling through while the world gradually orders itself through technological and commercial achievement.
Thank you very much. In conclusion, let me just say 2 words about my particular field, which is media. After all, this is a media forum. In my opinion, the media in many countries, probably in most, have played a very negative role in where we are today. The pictures that we get influence us, and we get pictures that are one-sided everywhere. I have worked in American media, French media, British media, and Russian media. And I can tell you with absolute knowledge that nowhere do you get a complete picture. You get the picture that people want you to have. This is true for Russian media today, which is I'm talking about influential media, which is controlled by the state. This is true for American media, which is controlled by conglomerates. This is true for all of them. They're politically motivated. And the real duty of the journalist to be objective as much as possible, to be truthful, and to give a full picture. We're not robots, we're human beings, but to know that you're doing your best no longer seems to be the case. It's about money, it's about politics, and it's not about keeping people informed. And I think that plays a very important role in where we stand. I want to thank the panel. I want to thank the audience. Be well and keep the peace.